The upcoming elections here in Tucson are so strange, and since they're like the elections all across the country, we should stop and have a talk about them. Before we do, however, let me remind myself what I fight for. I'm a Yank. I fight for, first, straightening myself up emotionally. I'm for race relegated to an endearing quality of your parents. I straighten my thoughts up. These thoughts that have to do with sex I associate with actually getting the gal pregnant and that sort of thing. And then I adopt the classic battle of good and evil, the priest or the pimp. The priest says, say what you mean and mean what you say. And the pimp knows how to hustle, con, manipulate, and intimidate people. And he's the very definition of what defines a bad guy as a bad guy. I put it together, and then if I choose to, the married life, I choose to be a good husband, and then a good father, and it spills into home economics. And it's home economics that gives society such a huge middle class, and becomes the ideal society, the one everybody says they fight for. Well, let's get started. Here in Tucson, there was a gentleman named Raul Grijalva. He just passed away, and he was a staple in the political scene here in Tucson for decades. When he was first getting started, way back when, he's one of the people I first heard talk about the Chicano movement. And I remember him because he described the Chicano movement as the Mexican, Hispanic, Black, and indigenous people against the white Caucasians. He was a bit racist, to put it mildly, and he belonged to a group called the Aztlans, if I have the name right, and they wanted to take this whole area and give it back to Mexico, with them in charge, of course. When he first got started, he had a job as a community organizer, which I took to be a Marxist thing, and he was on the school board for years and on the county board of supervisors, if I remember. Then he got elected in the Congress, and he was a staple in the Congress for quite some time. He, along with the feminists and the black civil rights guys and whatever the Joe Biden white guys, are responsible for changing our society from a huge middle class and home economics and the ideal society that we had into individual rights and a peasant and property class society, and from being normal and well-adjusted to being, well, not normal and well-adjusted. When he passed on, there was a funeral at the cathedral here in Tucson, and Nancy Pelosi was one of the people that gave a eulogy. And if you sit down and write out on a piece of paper what Raul Grijalva stood for and Nancy Pelosi stood for, and you sit down and write out what the Catholic Church stands for, remember all these things that you and I think of as democracy come out of monks and monasteries and the Pope and that sort of thing, and they're literal opposites. In fact, let me remind myself that there was a vicious revolution in Mexico in the 1920s between the Catholics and the Communists. The Communists won. They have a small group of people that runs everything. There's a huge gap, and there's a huge population of poverty. If you're arrested, you're guilty, and like all the other societies, everything's geared toward giving the ruling class what they want. And Raul Grijalva, Harry the hippie, and Al the Afro, and Donna the feminist, and Manny the Mexican, they're all part of that group. I certainly don't blame the priest for having to have a funeral there, but I certainly blame us. We keep voting these guys into office. We can't for the life of us seem to get them out of there. I have a bit of a neat trick for you. Pretend, daydream a bit, and there's American slavery, and we're in the slave quarters, and there's this big, beautiful mansion, a southern mansion, and there's the communist or the fascist living in that mansion, and forget about the idea of a society of saying that the state owns everything or private property owns everything. There's simply a group of people who are very ruthless, who take over the government and the press and the police and the courts, and if you say anything, they shoot you, and they turn around and say that all of society is geared towards giving them everything they want. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, a communist phrase, everything for the state, which is another way of saying everything for them. So we're in the slave quarters. We go out and farm the fields for them. We go out and work in the factories to build a car for them. We make a tennis racket so they can go out and play tennis. We do all the producing, they do all the consuming. And it's all about hustling and conning and manipulating and intimidating people. And that's what you should think of when you think of communists and fascists. That's as opposed to the sheriff of Dodge City, who throws out the people in the big house and they turn it into a Catholic cathedral. And now you choose to put the Pope in charge, and the Pope, the priest, and the nun maximize benefits and maximize utilities by adopting the leadership style of washing the feet of the apostles. And now we're in the pews. We start making big American cars for ourselves. We start making furniture and growing crops for ourselves. And the world changes. That's how you get home economics. That's how you get everybody out of poverty. It's a useful trick. I hope you adopt it. The reason I mentioned Raul Grijalva, because now his daughter is running for office, and the point is nothing's changed. Donald Trump ran not as a Republican. He changed from a Democrat to a Republican. He ran standing up to a bum's rush, and we're going to hold him to it, and nothing's changed. If I change the scale, there's a guy in New York who says he's a socialist. There's that AOC gal who always ends her speech by quoting something from the Communist Manifesto. They say Kamala Harris, the gal that ran for president, used to talk about changing things for the better or some such thing, and it was a communist a communist phrase, throwing out the old ways and the old this and that, the Chinese would say, and it was regarded from people who knew what she was saying as very vicious. It means that people would starve by the millions in order to trash society so they could come in and take it over. It just goes on and on, doesn't it? It doesn't make any difference what these guys call themselves, communists or fascists. They're the bad guys. They have no right voting. They have no right running for office. We don't choose to vote out a judicial court or a judicial press. You call the police. You fight for this, which you have an army for, to defend us. You only vote inside. So there's a whole group of people that took things over that have no right being part of our society. They just came in and cashed in on everything. So let me remind myself what I fight for. I fight for those three things. I fight to be the normal and well-adjusted, the ideal society out of Socrates and Aristotle and Plato. I'm first a normal, well-adjusted person, then I will the good of another person. I make money by making somebody else better off. And I do it because Christ rose on the third day. I adopt the Trinity as faith, God, and country, and I take it from there. So let's have a change of categories. If you're that young man I saw that was protesting ICE in Los Angeles, and they tried to burn the American flag, and you stood up and stood in between them and said, nope, you're not burning the American flag. You come over here. You're one of the good guys. Couldn't care less whether where you were born. There's so many millions of people that came up from Mexico. You have to come up with another way of thinking. Here's another way of thinking. There's not one thing keeping anybody from pushing that fence south. There's not one thing keeping that communist Mexican government from dissolving, adopting the American dollar. That government, just like the government here in Tucson, can get a garbage sack and they can go form a class of peasantry beneath the class of poverty that they caused. And they can, the feminist movement and the black civil rights movement and whatever you want to call the Joe Bidens, whether you consider Joe Biden a Republican or a Democrat, they can get over there and a whole lot of them can join it. We'll come over here and we'll have our world. So if you're that young man, you come over here. If you're the gal that doesn't want to spend her life putting her child in a daycare center and going to work in a communist factory so some feminist can be the front office gal, you come over here. If you're the young man in a housing project in Chicago and you've had enough of communist housing projects, and you want to be normal and well-adjusted, you come over here. We're a bunch of Yanks. So I hope you'll join our group. There's a group on Facebook and a group on Instagram called Time to Act, and there's a group on YouTube called The Priest or the Pimp. And if we can get you to join our group and start putting numbers to it. If you're a gal, how much of a budget do you need to run a 1950s household. And if you're a guy, how many hours would you have to work in order to come up with that? Once you do that, then we have something you can take to a guy like Donald Trump. You could do something about it. So I hope you join our group. I hope to see you.